Okay, so I guess I'm now the halftime entertainment. So I'm happy to do that. And really, it's nice to have Steve and Paul carry sort of the technical stuff, because usually I have to do that as well. So I can just talk about sort of how we got into this mess and how how we can get out of it. I think one of the things to sort of remember is that we have a really long history of dealing with this industry in central New York. In fact, we were one of the first communities in the country that was targeted for the development of nuclear power plants. And so, in Oswego, actually one of the reactors in Oswego and the reactor that's out near Rochester are the second and third oldest reactors in the country that are still operating. And they're both more than 40 years old, and in fact, they both should have shut down 2 years ago when their original licenses expired. And those licenses were renewed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission against all sorts of evidence that they were old and degrading and becoming unsafe. And in fact, that was my first experience working with Paul and Steve was 14 years ago when we found out about the cracking of the internal components at 9 Mile 1 that was, at that point, the most severe sort of aging-related safety problem in the country at a reactor. And what we found in the course of starting to work on that and really sort of starting to organize in this community was that the NRC, when it found out how bad the problem was, really just swept the problem under the rug and ignored the science and basically gave Niagara Mohawk, which owned the plant at the time, our former utility here, the permission essentially to stop shutting down and inspecting the plant for the safety problem. And that was a real window onto how the industry operates for us here in central New York at that time. And so what I wanted to kind of give you guys a sense of is sort of really how this industry operates, and given that how we need to sort of what our plans are as a GREE in this coalition. For how we're going to move forward and eventually shut these plants, and not just shut these plants, but actually sort of usher in a new power or a new era of green energy development and rebuild our economy based on that. Yeah, it's a great transition. So I guess one of the first things to sort of understand is why does the NRC refuse to act when there's such obvious problems going back for so many years. And essentially, what we have is, the nuclear industry was born during World War II and during the Manhattan Project, when the U.S. was searching for essentially the ultimate weapon, and realized that that there was this technology, by harnessing nuclear fission, that essentially the U.S. could dominate the world with that. And I mean, not just win World War II, but could actually dominate the world with the use of this technology. And the Manhattan Project, was this incredibly secret project. I mean, the government was investing billions of dollars in developing a bomb, but kept the entire thing secret, not just from the public, but from even the people most of the people who were working on it. I mean, the Manhattan Project was developed at hundreds of different sites across the country. Each site developing a different component of what would ultimately become the bomb, or some different piece of the technology. And only a central committee of scientists and engineers sort of knew how it all fit together and what the actual whole project was. And that was the way this industry was born, was essentially through a wedding of the government and this emerging industry, that felt like its mission was so important that it could remain secret from the entire country and not be accountable to anyone during a time of war. And so what happened after that was that, ultimately the bomb was created. People began to understand what this meant, for the future, and there began to be some concern about, this developing arms race, and the government needed a way to be able to make, to make the harnessing of atomic power seem palatable to the public. And so they basically pitched an idea to the utility industry in the country. They'd already been using nuclear reactors to create, both to practice enriching uranium to make nuclear fuel, but nuclear reactors also produce plutonium, which doesn't occur in nature, but that is very helpful for building a nuclear bomb, because you can build a bomb that's smaller in size but has a bigger punch than if you use uranium to build a bomb. And so they basically had the idea that they're already using these reactors to produce plutonium. They're also already producing all this energy and steam that just gets wasted. Why not hook a turbine up to it, and we can make electricity and sell it all over the country and give the people an idea that nuclear power is actually safe and beneficial. And so they pitched this idea to the utility industry, and the utility industry said, okay, well, that sounds good, but what happens if there's an accident? And they said, well, we have estimates of what that's going to be and what that's going to cost. And so the industry, found that, even though the idea seemed interesting, they couldn't find an insurer to insure them against the risk of building nuclear power plants all over the country. I mean, the financial consequences of an accident, they couldn't find someone to insure them, to compensate them for the damages that they'd be liable for. And so the government decided, okay, well, we really want to press forward with this. So they passed a piece of legislation in 1956 called the Price-Anderson Act, which essentially absolved the industry of financial liability for an accident. The Price-Anderson Act capped the liability of the entire nuclear industry if there's an accident of one of their plants, and basically said that the government, the public, would pay for it. And so that basically gave the industry the green light to start operating. And it basically did so by the government saying, we're going to sponsor this industry from cradle to grave. And so the industry dumped, the government dumped hundreds of millions of dollars into research and development for nuclear technology, and also in the early 1980s passed a piece of legislation called the Radioactive Waste Management Act, which essentially promised the nuclear industry that the U.S. government would take ownership of its waste. All this spent nuclear fuel that's generated in the course of operating reactors, the U.S. government would take ownership of the waste and pay for its disposal and its long-term management. And so essentially, this is an industry that doesn't have to bear any of the costs of any of its, or any of the risks of its own operations, ultimately, because the U.S. government has decided to sponsor it. And the original entity that was created to regulate the nuclear industry, the Atomic Energy Commission, was also the same agency that was tasked with sponsoring was sponsored with developing the nuclear industry, or atomic technology. And so this was an agency that was supposed to regulate and promote the same technology. So it was already a schizophrenic situation from the start. The AEC, after some of these problems began to come out, was dissolved in the 1970s and split up into two entities: the Department of Energy, which still exists, to promote nuclear power, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which was supposed to regulate nuclear power. And what we've seen since then, in the nearly 40 years since that happened, was that actually the ties between the NRC and the industry are still far too strong. And there's essentially, one of the signs of that is that there's a revolving door between the NRC and the industry, where people who work, for the NRC for several years end up going to work in the industry and making a fatter paycheck. And then there's people who are, sort of officials within the industry who end up getting jobs at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, ostensibly responsible for overseeing their former bosses. And so it's a completely schizophrenic situation that we have with the NRC, and it exists within this culture of secrecy and sort of a partnership with the industry that makes it really impenetrable to democracy. And what we as CAN, which is a grassroots group that's based here in the Northeast, what we've experienced is that the nuclear industry suffers from a meltdown of democracy. There's none of the democratic processes that we rely on in the U.S. to be able to sort of be a stopgap on corporate power and corporate abuse, on environmental risks, fails with the nuclear industry because of this partnership between the government and the industry. And one of the ways that plays out now is that in the 1990s, the way that the NRC is funded changed. The NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, is now funded not by taxpayers, but by fees on the industry that it regulates. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is funded by fees that are paid by the nuclear power plant operators. And what the nuclear power plant operators said to the NRC in the 90s was that if you don't back off your regulation, then we're going to go to Congress and get your, and basically get your budget cut by cutting these fees that we pay to you every year.
When did that start?
That was in the 1990s that shift took place. And the reason that took place was actually because despite the close ties between the industry and the NRC, in the aftermath of the 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl accidents, the NRC still had a vestige of of an inspection and oversight process that actually, between grassroots organizations that were opposing nuclear power and whistleblowers that were coming out from nuclear power plants, several nuclear power plants in the 1990s closed. There was Yankee Row in Massachusetts. There was the Zion 1 and 2 reactors in Illinois, the Trojan nuclear power plant in Oregon, the Maine Yankee nuclear power plant in New England, and the Connecticut Yankee and Millstone 1, 2, and 3 reactors in Connecticut, all closed because of citizen opposition, grassroots opposition, and whistleblowers coming out pointing out the safety problems that were happening at these plants. And the NRC didn't shut these plants down, mind you, because of safety violations. What they said was that, gosh, you have hundreds of violations going on in your plant right now. The plants are completely out of compliance with the designs. You need to fix these things. And what the industry basically, what these nuclear power plant operators basically decided to do when they were confronted with having to spend millions of dollars to bring their plants back up to code, is they decided to shut them instead. But what essentially happened is that the public and the workers were able to use the NRC process in the 1990s to start shutting plants. And the industry was faced with an existential threat. They hadn't started to build a new nuclear plant since the 1970s. It was approaching 20 years since they'd even begun to build the process of building a new nuclear plant. And now all their plants were getting old and reaching the age of retirement. And now the public was sort of catching on, the jig was up with the public and with a lot of workers. So the industry basically reined the NRC in and basically gutted the agency of any regulatory teeth. And so a number of things happened. There was the NRC changed the way that it oversees and inspects nuclear plants in the late 90s. They instituted what they call a reactor oversight program, which essentially, instead of the NRC having sort of a regular and comprehensive inspection program where it went into plants and it looked at their systems and how they were doing business, they came up with basically a scaled back kind of baseline inspection program that essentially waits until problems happen before the NRC steps in and looks at how they're doing things. So now, instead of having a regulator that actually goes into plants and inspects them, we now have a regulator that only goes in once a problem has happened. And so, and then in addition to that, what they started doing was they streamlined what they call the relicensing process. Originally, nuclear plants are licensed to operate by the NRC for 40 years. And with relicensing, they can extend the operating license for an extra 20 years. The NRC, the first time this came up was actually at the Yankee Row plant in Massachusetts, where it was a 30-year-old plant. In the late 1980s, the operator of the plant started to look at relicensing because they felt like they wanted to kind of pilot the process of relicensing. To show that it could be done. They actually wanted to be a leader in the field of relicensing so they could sell their services to the rest of the industry. And they had the oldest reactor operating in the country at the time. And so they started to go through the relicensing process. They had to do inspections of the plant to see how it was aging, whether there were safety problems that would result from the components becoming cracked and embrittled. And what they found was actually really alarming. They found that the reactor vessel, which is what contains the core and is the whole basis for even having the reactor not melt down, had become so embrittled in the 30 years that it existed that if there was an accident where they had to dump cold cooling water into the reactor to prevent a meltdown, that the reactor vessel could shatter like glass, and that there was a 1 in 10,000 chance of that happening. When a reactor is supposed to operate with a 1 in a million chance of a meltdown happening. This was operating at 1 in 10,000. And essentially what they've done is they reached out to NRC and said, well, we want to talk to you about a way to make this work without having to replace our reactor vessel. And they basically they started a negotiation with the NRC to be able to basically sweep the problem under the rug. And it was in the process of that actually CAN started it, in opposition to the Yankee Row reactor, and we had and in collaboration with the Union of Concerned Scientists and Paul's organization at the time, we found documents. We unearthed these documents and exposed it. And in response to that, the NRC had to sort of rein in the process and tell Yankee Atomic that it was going to have to it was actually going to have to fix its reactor vessel. And that was when they shut the plant. And so the first time that a reactor came up for relicensing, it shut down. And what the industry and the NRC did at that point was they worked out a streamlining of the relicensing process that doesn't require them to inspect the plants to make sure they're safe. And since that time, every single reactor that's applied for a license extension has gotten it. Over 60 reactors since then have applied for to be relicensed, and every single one of them has not been turned down.
There's no inspection process?
There's no they don't have to actually physically inspect the reactor to see if the components are safe.
You mean outside inspection?
A, B, C, D.
Right.
You mean outside inspection? The operators.
They don't even require the operators to do it. They don't have to go through the systems and inspect them to see if they're cracked or to see if they're likely to crack if there's an accident. None of that needs to take place anymore. All they need to do is prove that they have an aging management process within the plant's normal operations that will detect things if they're likely to go wrong. One of the consequences of that is that in early 2000s there was a reactor in Ohio called Davis-Besse, which was suspected of having a corrosion problem with the head of its reactor vessel. If you've seen on one of the slides, there was a picture of a reactor vessel where it shows where the control rods go in, which is through the top of the reactor vessel. So there are these small holes in the top of the reactor vessel. There was water leaking out of the top of the reactor, and it was suspected to be causing a problem. They were supposed to shut the reactor down at a certain point to do an inspection. And the operator went to the NRC and said, well, we know we're scheduled to do this, to shut down for this inspection, but we'd like to wait a few more months because then in a few more months we're scheduled to shut down for refueling anyway. Just let us do the inspection then. A few months, so the NRC staff actually, some NRC staff were not comfortable with it. They thought this was a pretty significant risk. Senior NRC staff told the staff to shut up about it because the financial interests of the plant operator were more important. And what did they find 4 months later when they shut down? That in fact there was a football-sized hole that had rusted through the top of that reactor vessel, and the only thing keeping it from melting down was like a 1/4-inch steel liner that lined the inside of the reactor vessel. It was starting to bulge through the hole. They were within weeks of that happening when the reactor shut down.
What reactor was that?
It was a plant called Davis-Besse.
Where?
In Ohio. So this is the depth of the partnership between the NRC and the industry. So essentially the NRC scaled back its inspection process and its regulations. It streamlined the relicensing process for all of these old reactors. And then what happened at the same time was that the states started to deregulate the utilities themselves. And what they did was, and this happened in New York, as well, was the state government told the utility companies that they only wanted the utility companies to deliver electricity now, and that they wanted the operations of power plants to be handled by merchant power companies, essentially larger corporations that focus solely on generating electricity and selling it on an open market. And so that happened in New York, and it happened in a bunch of other states as well. And what we saw happening was that instead of reactors being owned by state-owned, by utility companies that operated in states that were regulated by the state government, that essentially reactors were handed over in droves to these massive power corporations like Entergy and Constellation, that essentially were consolidating massive fleets of nuclear power plants and then running them basically purely for profit and purely on speculation. And so what they've done, what we've seen happen at the reactors in New York since Entergy and Constellation took them over, was massive cutting of staff. Back in the 90s, 9 Mile 1 and 2 employed 1,800 workers at that plant. There were 1,800 workers working at that plant. Now, there's about 900. They've literally cut the number of hands on deck by half in order to run these reactors. We were working with a whistleblower from the Fitzpatrick reactor several years ago, and he'd worked there since the late 90s when the New York Power Authority owned that plant. When he started working there as an engineer, the engineering department, they didn't have enough desks for everyone. He said they were literally crawling over each other for space in the engineering department, which is, where people, where the engineers design, fixes for problems that happen at the plant and make sure that it's running properly. By the time that he was fired by Entergy for reporting a safety problem in 2003, he said the engineering department was a ghost town. There was literally, there was, less than half of the number of engineers were being employed at the plant in order to keep it safe, and that they were constantly overworked with so much, they had so much work to do that they couldn't do it all. And so this is the way the industry operates. And I guess to wrap up, wanted to give a sense of how it is that we can change this. The NRC is clearly failing, as the NRC has evinced no willingness or opportunity, no willingness to actually act on any of these things to hold reactor operators accountable, because they're afraid that if they do, the industry is going to die and they're going to not have a job next week. So what we've done as CAN is actually started looking to other venues and other avenues. And what we've done, what we've been doing in Vermont for the last several years is building a campaign to get the state to exercise its authority to close these plants down, and it's working. What we did was we got the state legislature to pass legislation a few years ago that said that the operator couldn't run the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant past its 2012 March 21st 2012 license expiration without explicit permission from the state that they could do so. And in the process, they also set up a process where the legislature had to do hearings around the state, and there had to be inspections of the plant that would basically be able to inform the state's decision. And so this whole democratic process took place over the last several years in Vermont, where the power company was called before the legislature to answer questions, that there were inspections done at the site. And everything and along the way, there were safety problems that were happening. Legislators and the public at large were being informed about what an unsafe plant this was, and what a disaster was happening within their state, and that the utility company executives were lying to the state the entire time. They were asked, the utility company executives, for instance, were asked by the legislature, what about radioactive leaks at the plant? I mean, don't you have pipes that carry radioactive water? Couldn't they leak and contaminate the ground and the water? And the utility company executives told the legislature in a hearing that no such pipes existed at the plant, that there were no pipes underground that carried anything radioactive, and that there was no risk of that happening whatsoever. And then what happened? 2 years ago, they found that there were massive leaks of radioactive water at Vermont Yankee that were leaking into the ground, and that the utility company executives had bold-faced lied to the legislature 3 years ago. And within a week, a vote that we expected was going to be very borderline, like we weren't sure if we had a majority of the senators on our side or not, that turned a corner, and the Vermont Senate voted 26-4 basically to shut the reactor. And now we're in now the state's in a lawsuit, where the company is challenging all of these laws that they actually agreed to over the years that set up this process. The company is now basically bucking democracy and suing the states to have its own laws thrown out, for this. But what we've seen is that this actually works, and that we can do it. And so what we want, and so what the thought is in New York. Is that we actually have a chance to re-regulate nuclear power plants in New York State, and that what we need to do is to be able to put the if we can put the concerns and safety problems that are happening at these plants sort of on the agenda, that we can show that we can actually get the state to take action on this. What we've had happening over the last several years is a huge campaign downstate to shut the Indian Point reactors. And in fact, the entire sort of government apparatus of New York State has been has been occupied for the last several years in trying to figure out a way to shut that plant. But what they've been doing is they've been trying to go through the NRC to do it, and there's still there's a small chance that may end up being effective. But what we hear constantly from politicians in Albany is that they're totally tied up with Indian Point and they can't think about that they can't think about the reactors up here in central New York. And so it's up to us in central New York to be able to put this on the radar screen and to say, look, you can't just worry about Indian Point. This is a statewide problem. There may be 18 million people who live within 50 miles of Indian Point, but just because we have fewer people up here doesn't mean our lives don't matter. It doesn't mean our communities don't matter. And that we actually can do something, and we can actually shut these plants, and we can actually pursue a different path. And one of the things to think about in terms of this is the resources that we have at hand to be able to do it. One of the things that always gets the power companies always throw up in people's faces when confronted with the possibility of closing these plants is the jobs that will be lost. They terrorize us with thoughts of having power outages everywhere, that we're not going to be able to keep the lights on because there just won't be enough electricity. All of these sort of scare tactics that the industry employs to be able to get people to go back to sleep, which is essentially what they want us to do, is to really just go back to sleep. To get a sense of it, anyone have any idea of how much money we spend on electricity from nuclear power plants in upstate New York every year?
Spend on it in what sense? We as consumers pay for it?
Yeah, in aggregate, how much money they're making. This is so. What I'm trying to get at with this is that those 4 reactors that we have in our neighborhood, they're selling electricity to consumers in central and western and upstate New York every day. And so in the course of a year, we spend as consumers buying electricity from these companies that are putting us at risk $1.7 billion a year buying their electricity from these plants. If we could if we could mobilize
electricity of any source.
No, this is just the electricity from those 4 reactors. We'll be spending $1.7 billion a year for the foreseeable future because they continue to operate and sell electricity to us.
That's their income.
That's their income. It's about $1.7 billion a year. If we could take our money and do something different with it than pay them for their electricity, we could be creating green jobs throughout throughout central and western and upstate New York, retrofitting houses to be more energy efficient, building more energy efficient buildings, putting in, solar power and wind power and other renewable energy sources. We could rebuild our entire economy. That's $1.7 billion a year. If these reactors continue to operate until their licenses expire, this is with all the license extensions they've been granted, by 2046, we will have spent over $40 billion just buying electricity from old nuclear power plants in our neighborhood that we could have spent on something else. $40 billion. This is a massive amount of our resources that we could mobilize in a completely different direction and do something totally different with that would revitalize the entire region of upstate New York. And so that's the vision behind Degree. And this is sort of this is what we want to work on. And we've taken big steps already in Syracuse through things like the Public Power Coalition, where we've got a proposal on the table in Syracuse for the community to take ownership of the power company and to start providing our own power. And this is a model for how we can start to move this forward. But we want to look at it at a statewide level because it can't just be Syracuse. It's got to be Syracuse, it's got to be Oswego, it's got to be Rochester, it's got to be Buffalo. Everybody, as a state, we can mobilize these resources together, as New Yorkers to make this transformation happen. So, I guess I'll wrap up with that.
So, one of these fact sheets up here, the yellow one, has a picture of the Davis-Besse hole in it and a big description, so if you want to learn more about that, it's up here. I just want to let you all know real quick what Agree is doing here in Syracuse for you to get involved if you want to. There's a sign-up sheet up here. I encourage you to sign up, and we'll be contacting you about upcoming events. One of the things that we just did on Friday is we filed a petition with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission about the Fitzpatrick nuclear reactor, specifically about the vent that Paul was talking about, that they didn't install, and kind of challenging their plan and the assumptions. And we're going to be asking for people to co-sign that, to sort of be putting the pressure on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to accept that petition, and we'll also be showing that there's people power and showing that people care about nuclear power here in central New York. So we don't have a way for you to sign on to that petition yet, but if you put your name down on this sign-up sheet, we'll be contacting you about how to do that. We also have a website, which is agreenewyyork.org, and we'll be putting a lot of updates up there. We have a press conference tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. At the Syracuse Cultural Workers Building, which is right down the street, 400 Lodi Street. We're going to be announcing that petition to the NRC, to the press. So if you want to come hold a sign, you can do that. And then on the 24th, have little flyers here. There's a national Freeze Our Fukushima Solidarity Day. It's a solidarity day with the people of Vermont, since that reactor is supposed to shut down on the 21st, 22nd, and we don't think they're going to. There's a national protest against Entergy. So the Fitzpatrick plant is an Entergy plant, and we're trying to work out a way to protest up at Fitzpatrick. We'll be meeting at the Syracuse Center for Peace and Social Justice, which is, what's the 2013 East Genesee Street. It's kind of the intersection of East Genesee Street and Westcott Street. We'll be meeting there to carpool up to Oswego, so take a flyer and come to that. And we're also, Agree on the state level is working to get a study funded that would look at how New York can transition away from nuclear and carbon fuels. We want to go 100% nuclear and carbon free. And we're trying to get the New York State Legislature to fund that study, a really big, technical, detailed study about exactly how the state could do that. So if you get in touch with us, we'll be calling on you to help us pressure the state legislature to fund that study. I also want to take a quick moment to just thank Art Rage Gallery, the gallery that we're in. This is an amazing resource for the community. They allow a lot of organizations to host events here, so I encourage you to take a look at the amazing exhibit that's up and to support them any way you can. And we're going to be showing a quick little video that Jess Maxwell will introduce. And while we're showing that, I just want to pass around our little donation can to help Agree keep going.
So the Fukushima accident, I think, has highlighted for us all, again, the dangers, the tragedy of nuclear power, and I think sometimes it feels sort of dire and depressing, regulatory structures being so dysfunctional and not open to us, corporate greed seeming to win the day in a lot of cases. But at the same time, as Tim talked about some of the new opportunities, we've been pretty inspired by how some grassroots people have responded to Fukushima. There are people now designing iPhone apps so that people can take their own radiation readings, upload them to the internet, and rely on their own citizen-generated maps instead of having to rely on the industry or the government to get information. So we see a lot of really creative responses, and we thought this little video created by a group in the UK who's working to shut down their dirty, polluting energy corporations and switch to something more renewable was a great example of the kind of creativity that we can use to help generate a better vision and get people interested and compelled to work on this instead of just getting depressed and going home at the end of the day. So we wanted to leave you on an up note, and then our panelists will be happy to take questions, as Jessica and I would as well, about our strategy and what we're going to do moving forward.
I feel very awkward because two of us need to get to a credit union annual meeting, so and I don't mean to change the, and maybe you can't answer, but all this focus on Iran, and with the expertise you folks share on that, I wondered if there's any brief comment you might make about what Iran's nuclear development is doing in terms of what you understand of it, and is it a threat in terms of a nuclear weapon, or is that fairly obvious that the potential is there whenever you have nuclear development?
Well, let's look at a couple aspects of this. There are a lot of volatile nations that have the bomb. Maybe the most volatile is the one we're in. And other ones that are volatile are ones that we have given this technology to. If you're using commercial nuclear power, you are generating fuel for nuclear bombs. That's just basic to the reaction. So you can't have it both ways. You can't say, yes, let's have lots of commercial nuclear power. Let's promote this. Let's agree to spread this technology worldwide, and not also be comfortable with the fact that you are supplying people with the manufacturing, with the means to manufacture nuclear weapons grade material. And the other resources that they would need to refine it are something that is very difficult to hide. And if you think that by bombing them, you're going to set them back, well, that's likely, but for the idea of that you're going to set them back for the long term, I doubt it. I mean, the refining process, once they get there, if you're allowing them commercial nuclear reactors, the refining process for creating weapons grade material is not something I think that you're going to be able to stop.
The way we've addressed it is that uranium is the currency of a coin whose flip sides are nuclear weapons and nuclear power. They're inextricably connected in that, as Steve points out, through the uranium process, the uranium enrichment. And simply by building the infrastructure for nuclear power fuel enrichment, you can then repetitively enrich your power grade to weapons grade, and you can do that clandestinely. And even under the, in the International Atomic Energy Agency, in their simultaneous promotion and regulation globally of nuclear power, they provide that the peaceful atom is an inalienable right. And so countries like North Korea signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, produced the weapons material, and then basically thumb their nose at the handshake. And so this is how it's going to proceed. And right now, France is looking to market nuclear power to 13 countries in the Middle East. So it's not just Iran. We're the nuclear powers that be are looking to load up, a tinderbox with nuclear materials.
Yeah.
Do you want help with that?
If someone wants to just...
Great. I'll take a staff then. Okay. So you and then Peter? Go ahead.
Yeah. Most of the discussion today has been on older designs and older aging power plants. How does that compare with some of the newer designs in terms of safety?
So you can talk about that.
Right. Well, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission just certified a new reactor design. First of all, they're still all light water reactors, so there's nothing really revolutionary that's changed in terms of fourth generation as they're referred to. So the ones that are being certified and for construction, and the two that were given the combined operation license in Georgia are basically just they're pressurized water reactors. The problem is that when they're referenced as passively safe, that is just another myth. I mean, it's true that they are not, for example, the AP1000 Toshiba Westinghouse reactor, one of the passive safety features that is credited is that the emergency core cooling system for the reactor, rather than relying on lots of pumps and motors, is gravity fed. So they have put the emergency core cooling system reservoir perched on top of the reactor containment, which in our view is a little like putting a bullseye on it. And so what is promoted as a passive safety feature is another one of the vulnerabilities that we've addressed. And in fact, they're in the 17th revision of that design because of concerns that when that thing is loaded with water, it may not actually be supported by the structure below. So, some of the other revolutionary designs that are out there, though, are like these small modular reactors that are being promoted. But I have to say that we're working with a community of intertribal council along the Yukon River, which is concerned about another Toshiba small modular reactor. It's 100 megawatts, but it's a sodium-cooled reactor. So it's rather than water, it uses liquid sodium that's heated up by the reaction. And they're proposing, if this design can be certified, to put it on the Yukon River floodplain and put it under the Yukon permafrost. And they will have a nuclear power reactor that is using liquid sodium, which if it comes in contact with water, is it ignites. So you. Huh?
The fold change, who knows what the
Well, I mean, I think even just in the context of flood, they're putting this in a floodplain. And so, what you can't get away from is the inherent danger that comes with fissioning uranium.
Just to add to that, is it not true that the NRC also has a long-standing policy of not requiring new plants to be demonstrably safer than existing reactors? So there's, regardless of what potential designs exist, we have no guarantee that new plants would be.
I mean, there's a big issue for quality control, quality assurance right now. Because the industry's been all but more abundant in terms of new construction, a lot of the vendors that make nuclear grade parts, pumps, valves, fuses, bolts, I mean, it's right down to the nuts. They have to be nuclear grade. Those guys went out of business in the 80s because of lack of market. And now they're trying to revive this industry, but they're going to look to commercial, rather than nuclear grade, it's going to be commercial grade. So we're losing safety margins in the effort to restart this industry.
There's another aspect to this question, maybe two others. One is, can we build a reactor that's at a power level that might be useful for some purposes and might be safe? And I would say yes. There are lots of low power reactors used for physics research that I think can be kept running at a safe level and have a high level of safety protocols associated with them, and are for the specific purpose of exploring the world, understanding more about nuclear physics. I'm fine with those. One of the aspects of that is the purpose is to run them for understanding research, and safety is always going to be a priority. But when you're using them for power production and when you're using them for profit generation, and especially when you're competing in areas where there are other cheaper sources of fuel, there is always going to be this compromise between safety and profit. And that's a compromise where the decision making is being done by the people who are earning the profit for the most part, unless there is a better nuclear watchdog. But the ramifications of their decision are borne out by the community of people surrounding them. And unless you can have a balance of both the benefit, the people who are benefiting and the people who are making the decisions, then I don't think that you can actually make a good, rational decision on that issue.
There's just one quick point I'd like to make, though, just to remind us that electricity is but a fleeting byproduct of nuclear power. The legacy is nuclear waste, and so the ultimate product is nuclear waste. And we are now sitting on a mountain of nuclear waste that's 70 years high. December 2nd, 2012 will mark the first chain reaction in an atomic pile on Stagg Field in Chicago, where they generated, as part of the Manhattan Project, the first nuclear waste. We don't know what to do with that. That first cupful, we don't know what to do with in terms of long-term management. There's lots of theories, but we've just had a major, go back to step one. So ultimately, the major concern is that long after the last watt of benefit is gone, many, many, many more generations will have the liability.
Peter?
That kind of gets at the core of the questions I was going to ask. I was reflecting this morning about Fukushima and thinking about, first of all, the fact that the news did not cover the meltdown. The news only covered the tsunami and the earthquake today. So we really need to get busy and make some noise about that. But when I was reflecting, I was thinking of this fact that the legacy goes on for, an indefinite number of years, according to the half-lives of these various isotopes that are being generated all the time. And that can be really depressing if you just think that it's all about some things that a few people in secret had decided, and it goes on to affect the earth and the environment for so long. And I was trying to think of what could we do that would be long-lasting as a response or as a preventive to that. And I think, Tim, you kind of hit on it with those two things of divesting from what we're putting into buying this electricity right now. And at the same time, and I think, Steve, you alluded to this way back when we had the hearing up at Oswego about the new nuclear plant. When you asked the NRC guy, do you know what the cost of energy from efficiencies is? And the guy didn't know because they don't study that, right? NRC doesn't deal in efficiencies, I think is what he said. And so here we have it, that we could actually put this money into efficiencies and retrofit buildings and so forth. So I want to get at what are some specific things we could do to make that divestment happen, to leverage this, the utilities from putting money into nuclear electricity, and what do we need to do specifically as a community? Because you and me, everybody here, we're the ones that have the leverage to make community last forever, because we can make these things happen. What do we need to do to make policies that will bring this green jobs stuff to happen?
Sure. No, it's good that you raised this, Peter. I mean, I think and this ties into a little bit into the previous question about new reactors. I mean, one of the things that really brought the coalition that is the Alliance for a Green Economy together was concern about repeated proposals over the last 10 years to build a new nuclear reactor in Oswego, and just on the basis of thinking about why would we do that as opposed to something else, right? The reactor that's been proposed to be built in Oswego is, you know, a French reactor. It's, you know, it's never been, you know, there's not, you know, it's an experimental design. Nobody's ever used it before. But the cost estimate for, you know, for building it is something in the range of $12 to $15 billion.
Global.
Yeah, this is the estimate up front of what the cost is going to be, and you know the experience, you know, all along throughout history, you know, I mean the industry has been that the cost always always have cost overruns. It could end up costing closer to $16 or $20 billion to build that reactor. You know, they're only going to be at most 400 workers at that plant if they build it, you know, running it for the next, you know, 40, 50 years. You know, for 400 jobs, you know, we could, I mean, for $16 billion, we could create a lot more jobs in central New York and generate, you know, a lot more energy and save a lot more energy than by investing it in building that one plant. I mean, it's really, you know, but what happens is once that plant goes online, if there's not a process in place where we can reevaluate that decision, then essentially, you know, that plant is draining resources out of our community for the next 40, 50 years, right? And
sunk costs.
And sunk costs, and just, you know, in terms of like just ratepayers being captive to paying for the cost of doing that. I mean, it's really crazy, and that's $15 billion, not including what it costs to run the plant, you know, over and above that. So, you know, I mean, this is really about a choice, right, that we have to make, you know, as New Yorkers about, you know, where we're going to get our energy from, and, you know, and who we're going to pay for it. So I think that, you know, that fundamentally one of the questions is, you know, how do we sort of get our state, you know, to basically take its power back to regulate, you know, to regulate electricity and to, you know, to decide, you know, what kind of energy we have in the state. That's really what AGREE is about. And that's really, you know, what we're going to be sort of pushing for, and, you know, and advocating for this study, and, you know, trying to build a coalition that's statewide to really advocate for this. Now, one of the things that's, you know, that we need to take seriously as people who, you know, who are generally, you know, environmentally minded, is that not everybody is on our side, right? I mean, in Vermont, what we're seeing is, you know, even though there's this massive statewide, you know, movement to shut Vermont Yankee, you know, there's still a question of, you know, what's the state going to do for, you know, for electricity, and, you know, and there are proposals to build windmills in Vermont that are being opposed by environmentalists. Right? There are people who claim to be environmentalists, you know, and probably are environmentalists in a lot of ways, who are opposing the building of windmills, even though what it means is that it's the path forward to, you know, to being able to phase out all of this much more destructive, you know, energy generation. And, you know, and so I think that the concept behind AGREE was that we need to start a process, you know, as New Yorkers, to be able to build a consensus around what our vision for the future is. Right? This isn't just about, you know, we can put up 10,000 megawatts of wind and shut down 10,000 megawatts of coal and nuclear. You know, we need a process where, you know, where New Yorkers can all sort of get on the same page about how we're going to do this and make it happen. Because, you know, because if we're fighting with one another over, you know, whether a windmill goes up to replace Fitzpatrick, you know, then, we're going to get bogged down for decades. And we really need to take advantage of the moment that we're in and move forward. And so that's, you know, it's really going to be a grassroots process.
So we are unfortunately at time, so I'm going to take one more question, and then I would encourage people to hang around informally, chat with our panelists, chat with each other while we do a little cleanup, check out the information table, but we do need to kind of wrap it up. So new hands, Howie?
This study that you mentioned you want done, I wonder how that relates to the study that Patterson commissioned. My understanding is now under Cuomo there's a draft, and what I heard back in 2010 was whoever their consultant was, who I still haven't figured out, said we need 20 new nukes, and that was in the plan. The consultant was BNL, which I thought might be Brookhaven National Laboratory, and I looked there, and the only BNL I could find was this little firm in the DC area. So I don't even know who wrote the plan, and I know a guy in the labor movement who was a consultant, a part of it, who couldn't figure it out either. So I'm wondering how what you're proposing relates to that and where that stands, and if it's still got 20 nukes in it, is the way forward for New York and the state planning.
Yeah. No, I mean there was definitely an early draft of this is so the Patterson administration, you know, started the process to create a New York State energy plan. They actually do this every few years. I mean there's consistent revisions to what the state energy plan is going to be. It generally happens in this way that is, you know, pretty, you know, untransparent to the public. And there was an early draft of what this, you know, the most recent one that came out that did include recommendations, you know, that we needed nuclear power plants. They've since backed off of that, and now, you know, what's currently on the table is just saying that, you know, we want all options on the table. But this is really why we're, you know, why we're doing this, is to be able to, to sort of have a definitive study that says, look, this is we can actually do this without relying on nuclear power or fossil fuels.
So basically, you're setting the parameters up front. It's like nukes is out, more carbon is out. See how to get it.
Yeah, and in fact, there's actually been a number of recent studies that have come out. This is, I don't want to get too in the weeds with this, but there's been organization that we work with, the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, the Rocky Mountain Institute put out a book just this past fall. There's been researchers at University of California that have been putting out research on this that shows that it's technically completely feasible by 2050 to phase out all nuclear power and all fossil fuel generation sources worldwide for all uses: transportation, heating, electricity, industry, everything. By 2050, totally technologically and economically feasible. There's actually trillions of dollars that would be saved in in terms of electricity energy costs by doing this. What we're pushing for is to basically take that research that's been done sort of at the national and international level and take our state as an example. How do we do? Right? What's the mix of wind generation and solar and energy efficiency and conservation to be able to transform our state in this way, within the next 40 years?
It's a complex topic, and I hate to cut it off, but we really do need to wrap up, and I thank everybody for coming and participating. And like Jessica said, this is a burgeoning coalition. This is a crucial time, and things have really coalesced, I think, to make this a strong movement right now. We have some momentum, and I hope you'll stay in touch. Check out the website, connect to us on Facebook, and participate in upcoming events. Thanks.